Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Zachary Nowak's folklore, fake lore, history, invented tradition, and the origins of the pizza Margherita. This is a kind of article that I simultaneously love and kind of hate. And I mean that with a certain amount of affection and a certain amount of respect. I love it because it is a really interesting piece of research. The question has to do with the origins of a particular story, of a particular legend, and use the word legend appropriately, a particular legend having to do with the pizza Margherita. Now, pizza Margherita was purportedly a consequence of when King Umberto I, who was the second king of unified Italy, and his wife, Queen Margherita, were visiting Naples. And they were visiting Naples in 1889, in June of 1889. And the Queen, in particular, was very tired of French food because French cuisine was the standard for what would be considered palatable, what would be considered courtly food. And she was tired of that. So they sent for Raffaele Esposito. I'm presuming it's pronounced the Italian way Esposito as opposed to the Hispanic way Esposito. So Raffaele Esposito made three pizzas, apparently. One with lard, one with anchovies, and one a simple pizza with mozzarella, tomato, and basil. And that was apparently the Queen's favorite, Queen Margherita. She sent a thank you note indicating her great pleasure at this pizza, which may or may not have been an invention of the moment. The implication certainly is that it was an invention of the moment. And lo and behold, the three-colored pizza with the red, the white, and the green, corresponding coincidentally with the flag of unified Italy, quickly became basically the default pizza. And Nowak is interested in this. You might see that I am trying to figure out how to turn this into a circle. I have never made pizza and decided to try for the very first time doing it on camera. That might have been foolish. I've got the spread it out. I have yet to figure out the spread it out into a circle. But maybe it doesn't need to be a perfect circle. I have made the dough earlier today using basically a cup of double O flour and a cup of regular flour. I unfortunately had to use bread flour as opposed to all-purpose flour because I only have bread flour. I did not realize I did not have the proper flour until earlier, but hopefully that won't be too big of a deal. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. And I'm going to start all over again. Maybe this is a disastrous idea. But I made it earlier and it's been rising for 4 hours. I made a very simple tomato sauce with just a can of tomatoes, a splash of olive oil, and some salt. I prepared all the other ingredients. Oh, you're supposed to stretch it with your fingers, but now I perhaps have ruined it somehow. So now I'm going to use a rolling pin. I have had a pizza stone heating in an oven for over an hour. And as hot as that oven gets. It only gets to 450. It's a countertop oven, but we will see. So Nowak wants to sort of determine whether this is actually the case or not. Did this thing happen? Because one of the things that you can probably start reading into the legend, even if you don't know much about Italian history, is that there's a certain amount of convenience that happens with this story, clearly. that you have this intersection of royalty and common food, a street food. You have this serendipity, you have this rejection of French in favor of Italian, and then there are aspects that you might not know, I didn't know, so I'm not accusing you of anything, having to do with some of the more basic elements of Italian history at this time, where, as I said, the country had only recently been reunified in 1860. Umberto I was only the second king. His father had been the one who was in charge of that. And unification is already a problematic term to refer to this particular process because it has to do with the idea that unification was some kind of big, pleasant moment, as opposed to an actual, basically an absorption of some of the southern aspects, the southern territories, into the more politically affluent, politically powerful Piedmontese states. If I have that history correct, I'm supposed to drizzle a little bit of oil before I go for cheese. Oh, maybe too much oil. Again, I will spread with that. I'm also meant to use fresh mozzarella, but I was not able to find any in my Eastern Canadian grocery stores. Here's hoping this all works. And finally, I do not have a pizza peel. So getting it from here onto the stone might be tricky. But we'll see. You know what? I don't know exactly how this looks. I don't know exactly how this is going to feel, but it smells amazing. So within these processes of reunification, or unification, you have this demonstration of someone who's fundamentally, he's not an occupying power. He is the king. He is the king of this newly unified Italy that has the consequence of a lot of oppression, a lot of tyranny, argue as you will. Gramsci, the same guy who came up with the concept of hegemony, was no holds barred when he came to basically talking about the brutal dictatorship that came down to the South and usurped these places, and through pain of death, ground down the South until they agreed to, or at least, if not necessarily agreed, then at least accepted the fact that they would now be part of this larger unified Italy. When Umberto took the throne, instead of being Umberto IV, which he could have been if he had continued the Piedmont line, he took the number 1. He's like, no, I'm the first Umberto of a unified Italy, so I'm going to be Umberto I. In the same way that James VI of Scotland became James I of the United Kingdom, of England. Now I'm going to see if I can pop this into the stone. That was an unmitigated disaster. Maybe the second one will work better. Umberto had a good faith effort at trying to be decent with the South, and Naples in particular. His first visit to Naples had actually ended, there was an assassination attempt, which kept him away for a few years. But one of the reasons that he had concern with Naples is that they were in the middle of a cholera epidemic, or a flare-up of cholera, and this was in 1884. And he had actually visited at that time and expressed concern and met with people, which was, quite brave of him in many ways, and was a good PR move. And he did have certain amount of subsequent affection by the people of Naples for this very reason, that he demonstrated some kind of bravery, some kind of compassion simply by being present. So he was interested in actually this major renovation project, this way of cleaning up the poorer districts of Naples in order to try and open up the streets and make it less prone to cholera, even though they didn't necessarily have the same kind of understanding of the precise origins or natures of what caused cholera. Nowak wants to know whether this actually happened. And then he goes into the details. And Nowak is clearly a historian who is interested in dismantling folklore and legend. But he goes with the idea that perhaps this is what they call an invented tradition, that basically the state has, and because this has been one of the critiques of the legend the whole time, in that this is a way, not Umberto coming down to Naples and eating pizza, and Margherita coming down and eating pizza, but that this story was somehow planted by the press, by the monarchy, in a way of establishing some kind of legitimacy, the legitimacy that seems to have appeared as a consequence of this legend existing. So was this a deliberate act? And he, again, as I said, he systematically tries to dismantle whether that is the case or not. So Nowak basically identifies these 6 areas that he can potentially dismiss as the possible rationale for it. One is that were the king and queen in Naples at the time, and were they at the palace that they were meant to have stayed at? And this, even though it's not included in the original, in the version that he starts his article with, there is a letter that is contained and part of the proof of the legend in Esposito's pizzeria, pizzeria. He's a pizziola, and he works in a pizzeria. There is to this day a letter signed by a member of the Queen's staff recognizing that they are appreciative of the pizzas that he supplied to them when they were staying at this palace. So, and that is part of the overarching legend. Mythology is what he uses it, but this is a legend paper, so we're going to use the word legend. You know, what gives it credence is this piece of paper that you can go and visit and see to this day. So were they at this palace? Well, they were there in June of 1889. They were at least in Naples in 1889, and Margherita was at the palace, that particular palace, for a while, but when her husband showed, they moved to a different palace. So they were never together, and in that space and time there. Fine, okay, so dismantle one part of the legend. The second has to do with the idea that the Queen was potentially tired of French cuisine. And by any indications, the court was still serving not simply French cuisine, but printing menus in French up until 1909, 1910. And with no indication of sort of more of, they were using French even for classic Italian dishes. So French was the language of food, even if it wasn't entirely the content of food. But this idea that she was rolling her eyes at the prospect of French food is more or less unfounded. It's not an impossibility, but it is not proven. The third has to do with whether they would be seeking out pizza. And pizza at this time, at the very least, it didn't have, because we're still dealing with 19th century attitudes, it didn't have this connotation of a desirable, that its humility, its humbleness was in any way sort of desirable. It's like, oh, well, let's just have something simple. Let's have the food of the peasants. It wasn't in that, operating in that kind of way. For one thing, this was a time of cholera, and the idea of having street food would have been very, very hesitant for people in positions of power and people in positions of wealth. And it had a negative connotation. The food itself was not the foodways and food customs had yet to go through that kind of process of, well, really, that process of nationalism. You can make an argument that this is one of the building blocks of that nationalism, and not simply the Italian cuisine, but Italian street food like pizza becoming part of the argument. It had yet to do that. So the idea that you're like, why don't we order pizza, is also probably not founded. Checking again. So now the question is whether people would have necessarily sought out Raffaele Esposito as the pizzeria, as the potential, as the premier pizza maker in Naples. And by the historical record, no, he doesn't necessarily seem to have had any particular esteem or any particular reputation. He didn't have a negative one, but he didn't necessarily have a positive one, in as much as any of them had positive ones. It is interesting that his particular pizzeria lasted into the 20th century. But a lot of that might have had to do with the fact that he was a savvy businessman. He was clearly interested in marketing. He had renamed his pizzeria, the Pizzeria for the Queen of Italy, well before this so-called encounter in 1889. He had put in the about 2 decades before, he had put in for permission to be the royal supplier or have the royal imprimatur on some of his products, and it's possible that he was granted that. But he was ambitious. But it's unclear whether he had that reputation at all. In fact, if he did, that reputation is probably post hoc, either after 1889 or maybe even posthumously. So but it was unlikely that anyone in the king or queen's circle, and I'll start with the queen because she's so closely associated with this, is that anyone in the circle was necessarily interested or keyed into Esposito as the pizza maker of the time. Whether again the question whether pizzas were prepared, whether this was the actual pizza of choice, and it seems clear that. Because so much of the legend has to do with how this pizza is an invention at the time, almost this moment of inspiration created especially for Queen Margherita. Whereas clearly that isn't necessarily the case, because up to 30 years previously, what's the actual date? In 1853, so doing the math, 36 years prior to that, there had already been a cookbook that indicated that this was one of the standard ways of making pizza, with basil and tomato and mozzarella. So the idea that this was a fresh invention, and a fresh invention that's sometimes associated with Esposito's wife, as sort of adding the flourish of basil, is again not founded. Checking for that. I'm going to give this a slice. I'm going to see what it's like. Clearly it is not round. It's also still fairly hot. It doesn't look terrible, does it? But we will see. I'm going to give it a whirl. It's very hot. It's fine. It's possible. I hope the other one, since this is the one that I rolled, I'm wondering if the crust becomes less glutinous, because I did less to it. It's not bad though. In and of itself, it's reasonably tasty. So, but yeah, it's not proven that this pizza, as much as any of it is proven, it's not proven that this pizza was a particular invention. And finally, the last thing, the idea that there was a note. It seems clear that this note was a post hoc forgery. It doesn't match. There's no record of it existing in archives, and I mean, archives are practically designed for royal families to keep track of their correspondence, because if everything that they say has power to it, then you want to have a record, and it doesn't appear. And the letter, judging from other letters that were written by the same member of the household, and how it's designed, and how the words sound, and the handwriting, and all these sorts of things, it clearly is not an official piece of correspondence. So there you go. Boo! He's ruining everybody's day, Zachary, by pointing out the flaws. Now, then he asks the question, okay, so if this is not a thing, where does it come from? Is it an invention? Because this would be a popular piece of nationalist invented tradition. This is something that helps to humanize, is the word that we might use nowadays, but helps to provide the royal family with a certain amount of authority, win esteem, win prestige, win popularity, win something over the common people by bridging that gap. So whether this was an invented tradition would seem to at least indicate that there might be some traces of how that tradition was spread. So let's say that the royal family decided this would be a good thing to try and inculcate as a moment of their humanity and a moment of their ingratiation with the people. How would they go about doing it? Well, they basically did have control of the press, the way that many other royal families had control of their presses in their respective countries. And that because they not only were a commercial information service, but they needed to have sort of royal assent. In one of the ways of getting royal assent was also by being not spokespeople necessarily, but the medium, the telegraph service, the medium through which royal correspondence or royal messages could be sent gratis, and also basically the press of choice. So stories that if they wanted to promulgate a particular story, they would use the presses, and these stories did not appear in the popular press at all. So the Agenzia Stefani never actually, which is the name of that particular wire service, never actually had made mention of this story. So it doesn't seem to be an official creation. So if it doesn't come from the royal family, where does it come from? And it seems to be, more than anything, this clever bit of marketing, that whether this was a piece of actual family lore or just a local tradition that has that kind of thing, like a free associating legend that are sometimes attached to various celebrities. It's someone of particular esteem came into this sphere where normally they would not be they would not normally be found. An encounter with a regular person, and in the process of that encounter, some kind of interaction was had that is story worthy. And in this instance, so the idea of a noble person coming in and having a humble food and finding that experience revelatory and worthy of their time, just seems to be something that we can see. I mean, and you go into restaurants and you'll see the pictures of famous people who've eaten there. That's not that much of a stretch from it. A famous person ate here once and seemed to enjoy it. Obama goes and eats the Obama cookies at that bakery in Ottawa, and their picture is now everywhere at that bakery. Why wouldn't it be? So you have this process of basically branding that a couple of decades later, in the middle of the 1920s, the same pizzeria had now passed in and out of the family and is now back in the hands of Esposito's former father-in-law, former because everyone's dead at this point, his wife's family, and this is actually his wife's nephews. And they, seemingly at this time, more or less revived this story, gave it the names, gave it the dates, came up with the letter, and framed this story. The story might have been existing in oral tradition in a variety of forms. It might have been circulated and attributed to a number of different pizzerias, but they claimed it as their own. And once they claimed it and sort of established it in that way, it then kind of re-entered into oral tradition, but just now with the proof of it, the demonstration of it. So as I said, I'm going to check this pizza. How's this one now? Let's see, what I really want to see is the bottom. Well, the bottom looks a little bit, I can't take a picture of the bottom. It's too hot, but I think it's a little bit better than that one. Essentially, this is a piece of branding. And the question that distinguishes my approach, or how I would do it with what Nowak is suggesting, is that Nowak seems to suggest that for once and for all, there should be a definitive answer to whether this story is true. And then, in a way, he is willing to then say, but, as far as he is concerned, it is allowed to exist. It might be a self-defeating exercise to try and disprove it for the purposes of the masses, but here, once and for all, is a kind of written record of it. Okay, sure, that's fine. And perhaps he has a point. And he's a historian. And historians have different points and different agendas than folklorists. But folklorists are interested in the truth, but it is much more interesting to really double down and see not simply what critics imagine as the importance of that story, but the people who tell it, who tell it earnestly. Why is it? What is it about the story that gives it that level of permanence, that gives it that level of staying power? Why does a story work? And why a story works, particularly one which, if you want to, you can disprove, is that it does touch on so many things. And he would argue, because his two arguments are basically, or maybe he makes a third, but he can't substantiate the third because he can't think through the third. But basically, his two arguments are, you can see how legends like this are part of the invention of tradition, and how that this is almost too perfect a story, and it's the kind of thing that a state that is trying to consolidate power and humanize itself and gloss over its infelicities when it comes to such things as rights and freedoms and how it has usurped property and killed people and all that. That this is the great kind of thing that people will do. It's the same way that when the sort of invention of clans in Scotland, and really the invention of the clan tradition and the tartan stuff, and all the royal houses and the seals and everything, which were basically sort of extrapolated in English-style aristocracy onto the Scots, but the Scots who were complicit more than anything in the annexation of Scotland to England, or the conquering of Scotland. And so they set up these sort of puppet regimes and created this clan tradition that blurred the blood spilled as a consequence of it. This is sort of part and parcel with that. But then he says, well, then we would have some kind of evidence of this trace. And then his second argument is cynical marketing. It's like, cynical marketing is fine. So someone had this thing and employed that term folklore or folklorismus, or the various terms that they Dorson's idea of fake lore, that they bring something and that they create out of whole cloth, or they create out of the tendrils of actual tradition something that seems like it could be authentic, but really is for purposes of making some kind of rhetorical argument. And it's more, this is the role of popularizers as opposed to the state. So it's similar to the invention of tradition, but invention of tradition always has that sort of top down, and this basically always has to do with this popular culture aspect. And that's what he suggests, that this is the origins. But that doesn't suggest why it stays, and that doesn't suggest why it worked in the first place. And I don't think he quite has the apparatus for that. It does touch on things. It does touch on this idea that perhaps there is a genuine thirst for the rationalization of a conquered people with the now quotidian necessity to accommodate the conquerors. And so it's like, doesn't the story humanize them? And we will grasp at that. We will cling to that. It does speak about the elevation of a previously not simply humble but humiliated food into national consciousness. It does have this association of bridging this gap between regions and creating a sense of whole, a unified Italy, not simply in terms of its political terms, but in terms of its broad-based understanding. It also can enter into a tourist complex. It can be extrapolated onto the larger Italian diaspora, where, because of such things as the upset that was caused by the unification and the great Italian migration to North America, where now people weren't being defined, once they became an ethnic community, they weren't being defined by their region. They were being defined by what the dominant hegemonic white force understood as what they had in common, i.e. they were all Italian, because they spoke the same language despite the fact that they had radically different traditions. The need for some kind of pan-Italianness works. So there's tensions that are being met, or that are being the tensions are creative moments that generate these kind of stories, as if not necessarily in their initial telling, then in their retelling. And it's the retelling of stories, it's the variation of stories that he is not quite equipped to deal with. Nevertheless, wasn't this a fun article? It's fun, and it's well written. It's a good read. I think we would enjoy it. All right, pizza number 2, much thicker crust. This is meant to be a 12-inch pizza. Did not stretch out nearly as far. How is this? Oh, that's still too hot. But I think ultimately that's better. Yeah, that works. Am I now going to quit my lucrative career of folklore and enter into the hard scrabble life of being a pizziola? Probably not. But anyway, I have enjoyed, as frustrating and as demonstrating my limitations as this exercise might have been, I have enjoyed spending this little time with you talking about Zachary Nowak's folklore, fake lore, history, invented tradition, and the origins of the pizza Margherita. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well and eat well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.